and welcome to the second day of the Booker T. Washington Economic Development Summit. We're going to be focusing on digital marketing today. We're going to go ahead and get started after our brief break. We'd like to thank all of the panelists from the last session. We appreciate everything that they contributed to the discussion, but right now we're going to move on to a panel discussion on broadband access, the need for speed. And we are very honored to have as our moderator for this program, Mr. Boyd Stevens, who is the founder of Netelysis. And on the panel, we will have Mr. Ed Hudson, who is no stranger to Tuskegee University, who is an IT consultant for Advanced Technology Group, LLC, and also Mr. Murphy, program manager of Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs, who are also friends of Tuskegee University as well, who've helped us a lot with our programs. We appreciate ADECA and everything that they do. So right now, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and pass the floor on to Mr. Stevens.
Well, the subject matter this morning, at least from the title, Broadband Access, the Need for Speed, as I reached out to the panelists, we somewhat morphed or have attempted to morph the conversation. I think in 2020, most people realize the need, right? And most people realize the need for the speed. The overarching question is why in 2020, so few folk, especially folk of color, and folk who may be in rural areas, what has been the inhibitors of their gaining access to that speed? And it's become a pretty thorny issue. I mean, at one time, when I first got into the industry, it was almost a luxury and a novelty. I first experienced the internet at university. And I still remember the first time I saw a guy sending an email. He was a graduate student, and I was a freshman, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said, I'm sending an email, and that I've been there ever since, right? But fast forward almost 30 years, the need has increased, but I won't even call it access. I'd call it just what is this thing that's blocking, right? And so our panelists, we proposed a few questions, and we kind of like to start with those, Mr. Hudson, Mr. Murphy. Normally it's this issue of cost, right? That's normally the first thing that comes up, things being affordable. But I've been doing this for long enough to where I've seen a whole lot of money flow into this arena. I go back 10 years ago to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and all of that money that flowed down to the local areas, and now we're looking at the Alabama Broadband Accessibility Fund. And what I'd like to ask Mr. Hudson as well as Mr. Murphy, I'd like to inquire of them, what do they see as the greater set of challenges of those funds actually trickling down to the people who need the most, to the people? I mean, we see a lot of the telcos gain those access to those funds, and we hear about the projects that are going on, yet when we look at some of the accessibility maps, they haven't changed much. And so I'm really curious, Mr. Murphy, his perspective based in government, and then Mr. Hudson's perspective as a consultant and really on the ground. What are their thoughts about some of those inhibitors of getting those funds that have been flowing for the last 10, 12 years to the hands of the people? Mr. Hudson, Mr. Murphy, whoever would like to tackle that one first.
Well, good morning. My name is Chris Murphy. Again, I work for the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs in our partially broadband office, and I will mention a couple things. The Alabama Broadband Accessibility Fund was created in 2018 by Governor Ivey in an effort to provide internet, as you said, to rural areas and particularly African American areas, and where there is not at least one provider of internet right now. And that has, like I said, been around since 2018. We funded, I want to say, about 10 grants that first year, and then we had some last year. But this past year, it's really kind of taken off. We've had awarded almost approximately 40 grants out to providers across the state to get broadband into those areas that are in need. And part of the requirements for the program is that, like I said, they're not receiving internet. They don't have at least one provider of internet, that they're rural, and that kind of thing. So I don't know if that answered all your questions, but if I missed some or you need me to expound on something else, I'll be happy to do that.
No, that's good. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. Mr. Hudson?
Well, I'm going to take a different route to this because the things that have happened with from the private sector side is that from the allocation point, straight from the sectors, government, education, medical, industrial, and commercial, of course, coming down to the jurisdictions, the federal, state, local group, and individuals who are getting this money. If you just applied a 20% takeoff from each one of those steps down, by the time it got into the community, to the local user, that $100,000 was less than $20,000, and you can't even buy a decent router for $20,000 because of the administrative takeoffs. Then they got into, well, let's make the business case. And those numbers danced all over the place from less than 20,000 to less than 15,000 to less than 5,000. And we're talking about LMI, low to moderate income communities, where you don't have the flexibility of income or household budgets. So to answer the question so we can move through this very quickly, the problem has not been the funding and who's getting the funding, who understand the supply chain, who understand the demand side of the supply chain, as well as the provider side. So it's not by intent, it's more by ignorance. Giving someone a nice grant and then stopping it in 3 years has no sustainability. So the challenge becomes, how do I obtain and sustain broadband and leave it hyper local so that those end users and stakeholders benefit more than the providers?
So if you ask anyone that knows me, they know I'm not really into expounding only on the problems. Okay. So in this particular space, Mr. Hudson, you opened up a door. What would be some suggestions that you would put on the table to address some of these issues that we're talking about right now? Any suggestions on how to approach that problem?
Well, the biggest suggestion and the most useful way is do the things that you could do on your side. Okay? Problem solving 101. Okay. Do what you can do. Stop waiting on Superman. Stop waiting on the government. Stop waiting on subsidies. Do what you can do. We have 2.7 billion from the first day, the gentleman informed us, in spending money. That's a lot in the economy. Okay? But few people know there's 2.2 trillion that's spent on federal assistance. Half of that goes direct to end users. If we leverage that money, so instead of giving me the money just to get transportation, I pool my money and buy a car, and we run that car for Uber, and we make subsidized unrestricted income. Those kind of strategies make a lot of sense for us, and we got to do them ourselves. So there are strategies and solutions that I have been working with Tuskegee now for over 2 years, Dr. Vaughn, just to get this moving forward, and we actually got the proposals ready to go. Thank God for Dr. Hill circled back around when COVID hit, because the only way you're going to have a dual network ready to go virtual, as well as support the in-person school and government functions, we can leverage all of those funds. I'll leave you with one thought as I turn over to Chris had any questions. We've got to realize that we are a product. That LMI community is a product. You don't pay a dime for Facebook, but Facebook make $10 off of you. Actually, they say $9 and change. You don't pay a dime for LinkedIn and Pinterest, but they make money off of you, all because of a third-party pay model that allows them to sell your eyeballs. Well, let's take some of our people and take it at $40 a head through telehealth, telemedicine, and other avenues that we are the 10% with diabetes and the 30% with obesity and the 40% with some chronic disease, and leverage that to create use cases, such as a keyword I want to use all day, that generates enough revenue to give us at least 35% of that revenue to stay in community. And I pass it back to you, sir.
Well, Mr. Murphy, as you approach the same question, could you maybe talk with the audience about how can the individual citizen assist agencies such as yours in accomplishing what Mr. Hudson's suggesting, and working to maximize some of those funds, making it to the end user? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest ways, and this is something we pushed actually before COVID hit, but as we all know, with the COVID pandemic, that's really kind of made virtual accessibility even more important, is the Alabama Broadband Speed Survey. And that is designed to gather data about the availability and speed of internet service, including those areas that are lacking internet service. We do have a map that we use to base whether an area is served or not, but some of that data is flawed. And so we're trying to get more accurate data. We're trying to get information, and what I can do is I can post that website in the chat box, because I would strongly encourage everybody to go, whether you have internet or not, whether you're happy with your internet provider or not, because that really gives us an idea of where are those areas. We know some areas, but where are those areas that may on the map say, oh, they're served, but they're not truly served, or they're not being provided with the speed that they should be getting.
And so, Mr. Murphy, we have a question here that's kind of in this space. An attendee is asking, what type of technical assistance does the state provide or contract out to third parties to work in this area? So you talked about the mapping. So we all know, if anyone's paid attention to the space, it's almost as if everybody's broadband or data maps are superly erroneous, right? The FCC's maps, way off. Private industry has done analysis of the same geographical area, and the math just is so far apart between what the FCC is reporting and what the private industry is reporting. What do you see, what kind of resources are in place for the average citizen here in Alabama to assist with correcting the mapping? To what type of technical assistance is, so that's the one-way street, right? How the citizen can help you at ADECA, and then what type of resources are there for ADECA to assist the average citizenry?
Sure. So like I just mentioned, the speed survey is the biggest way each individual can help, because we use that data. We don't use it for marketing purposes or anything like that, but we use that data to get a more clear sense of what areas are not served. As far as the technical assistance, and I'll post the website for this that I'm about to talk about as well, we do have a website for our broadband program, and anybody, particularly providers that want information, when funding opportunities are available, they can sign up for a mailing list and an updated list of opportunities, and so I'll be glad to post both of those website information.
And we have one more question for you, because it's somewhat related, Mr. Murphy.
Sure.
And Mr. Hudson, please feel free to kind of comment on this too from a private industry's perspective. It talks about ADECA having grant money that you mentioned. And the question is, does any of those funds flow to municipalities, or do you only flow them out to telecommunication companies?
Well, unfortunately right now, they are just to the community, or the companies that provide broadband. That's part of the legislation, that it has to go to providers. It can't go to a city, an individual, a community agency. So to answer that question.
Let me also chime in on that, sir, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay. First of all, in the interest of time and to get to the key points, because this is going to blow some people away, we need to get away from this grant mentality. We need to get away from benevolence and go to business. You're sitting there going after money that only 20 to 25% will approve. ADECA may award 20 people, now I admire them for doing it, but 40 qualified grants with money enough to match the grant are sitting out there with projects that private investors would come back very quickly and use the match of seed capital and grow within that community or business that is a customer to that same provider without threatening the incumbent. We've got to stop thinking that rural communities are families and they're just sitting there waiting to cooperate. I have a family. I love them a lot. Don't like them sometimes, but I love them a lot. That's the way these rural communities are. These critical facilities in these communities, what we call anchor institutions, they have long-held biases against each other. So you have to go to the private sector, get Deloitte to validate your project, get IBM to give you technical assurance, get the local professional to write the check. Now you come away from all the evaluative criteria. I spent the last 3 days in USDF, MBI, and NTIA seminars getting ready for 2021 money. And here's the crazy part. If you go for a loan instead of a loan grant or a straight grant, you can get money for 2%. That 2% can earn you 6 figures a month, okay? A $5 million grant to build out a service delivery platform that is served by the ADECA grant provided entities, as well as the existing AT&T's charters and so forth, because isn't it amazing that they always have service in that unserved neighborhood at just the right ratio to stop you from getting a grant? So I'm sorry I get on my soapbox in a hurry and say, let's stop this madness.
No.
Do business.
So you're taking the conversation back to a comment you made a few moments ago, and I really want to come back and visit that. You suggested that the economic solution to our broadband issues revolve around solidarity, pooling resources.
Yes.
Okay. And bringing together not only the buying power, but when the government does offer assistance, pooling those resources.
Yes.
And it's in that space, let's talk about these $400 vouchers that the Alabama Broadband Connectivity for Students program has put out there. And maybe paint a picture for us of what could be possible for that $100 million fund if the end user recipients were to pool their $400 vouchers together for the remainder of the year.
Chris, you want to respond first, and I'll go. I'm sorry, I can.
That's fine.
Either.
So as you mentioned, there was $100 million in part of the CARES Act funding that went to these ABC vouchers, and that went to K through 12 students for giving them access to internet where either they didn't have it before, or is it too expensive, low income households, all those kind of things. And those students, part of the eligibility requirements, that they are the National School Lunch Program. So that was, as you said, where that was sent out.
Mr. Hudson?
Yes, that went out, and it's I'm very blunt, so please forgive me, but that is the dope dealer's approach to funding stuff. You give somebody something for 4 months that they need for the rest of their life, and in 4 months you're gonna make them either pay for it or lose it. Nice model, but it just doesn't work long term. This is the exact sustainability thing we're talking about. So we got 4 months basically to leverage that to go ahead and get corporations for the people who did not get funded, for the operators in those areas. There's loans, not loans, there are loans and grants and outright subsidies for farmers who don't have a succession plan, for growers who wants to do a grower complex, for research who wants to go through small business innovative research that don't have any of those restrictions, and you do not have to submit maps. We have map traps where we try to satisfy a certain criteria, and they know it's unmeetable because it's been slanted that way forever. It doesn't matter. I can go in any neighborhood and ask you where the poor folks, and they'll name every community for you. I had the superintendent of school run off 8 areas. It doesn't matter whether they're 90% or 10% or 1%. When you're paying the bill, it's just like having Wi-Fi in a hotel or Wi-Fi in a hospital or Wi-Fi in a gym. We're delivering services. Let's take that $400. Let's find out if that a provider who just picked up all this free money is willing to come into us as a provider for a private sector grant. Do you realize that there are companies, only 230 CDCs, that will lend money to a viable project and you can actually borrow the injection. That's down payment to other folks. You can borrow the whole thing. It's crazy.
So you're back to the whole business proposition.
Always business.
Look at business. Look at this as a business proposition. So we're running lean on time, but I've got to get this in. So one of the participants or one of the viewers mentioned about these, how a place, location up in South Carolina, in order to address their needs, they had Wi-Fi hotspots. And, you know, everyone on the call knows that certain mobile technology is very limited in terms of performance and price. But could you and Mr. Murphy talk about some other viable technologies that are on the landscape? Because what you hear when you start talking about these programs, everybody keeps talking about fiber to the home, fiber to the home. Well, that's a great thing, but I like the language you use, Mr. Hudson, delivering of services. Don't get caught up in the tech. Whatever is going to get those bits from point A to point B at a speed that's acceptable enough for us to have the performance we need to accomplish the service is acceptable. Can you talk about some of the technologies that don't get their due, like fixed wireless, where you can move a gigabit of data through the air, like, you know, just other technologies that are just as resilient and just as vibrant, and the performance price is just through the roof, right? You get a lot of performance for a single dime. Can you talk about that briefly, either of you?
Sure.
Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead, Chris. No, that's fine. So you bring up a very good point, and that is important because, as we all know, that sometimes you live in those areas that either have terrain that is very hard to get the cables in the ground, or there's a lot of foliage, and so there's issues all around that. And so